The plane touched down at Los Angeles International Airport, and Margaret felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. She hadn't seen her children, Daniel and Rebecca, or her 4-year-old grandson, Liam, in over 6 months. She had flown all the way from Phoenix, her suitcase packed with carefully chosen clothes, gifts for the children, and her favorite homemade cookies. As she wheeled her luggage through the bustling terminal, she could almost hear Daniel's voice. "Mom, you're coming. We'll pick you up right at baggage claim." Her heart raced. She imagined the hugs, the laughter, the family moments she had been longing for. Minutes stretched into half an hour, and then an hour. Margaret's excitement began to crumble. She called Daniel's cell phone. No answer. She called Rebecca. Voicemail. By the time 2 hours had passed, a sinking feeling had taken root in her chest. People moved around her with their luggage, families reunited, and she felt a cold isolation that she hadn't anticipated. She sat down on a hard plastic bench, clutching her purse, trying to make sense of what was happening. Finally, Daniel called back. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said, voice tight. We had to leave. Traffic, the kids, the babysitter for Liam. We couldn't wait." Margaret stared at her phone in disbelief. Could this be real? After all she had done for them, years of care, financial help, love. This was how they repaid her? Stranded in a foreign city, far from her home in Phoenix, with no hotel booked, no rides arranged, and no one to turn to. A kind stranger noticed her sitting alone, her eyes red from crying, and offered help. Margaret accepted, still in shock. As she sat in a small cafe near the airport, sipping a lukewarm coffee, a mix of anger and betrayal simmered inside her. She had been abandoned, yes, but Margaret was far from helpless. The memory of the Phoenix house, the house Daniel and Rebecca thought they owned outright, flashed in her mind. She realized something chilling. She held all the legal power. They might have left her on the highway or at the airport, but they had underestimated her. And that realization sparked the first embers of a plan that would turn the tables completely. Margaret returned to her tiny hotel room, the city lights of Los Angeles twinkling like indifferent stars outside her window. She unpacked her suitcase slowly, carefully laying out the clothes she had brought for Daniel, Rebecca, and little Liam. Each item seemed to mock her, reminders of love and care given freely, now returned with betrayal. She called her lawyer back in Phoenix, pretending casual concern about her flight and accommodations. "Everything's fine, just a short visit," she said smoothly, keeping her voice light. But inside, a storm was brewing. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Margaret's thoughts drifted to the house. Her house, the one Daniel and Rebecca had assumed they had inherited automatically, the one they had been using as their own for years while she continued to pay property taxes and handle the utilities. They had taken it for granted, she thought bitterly. And they had abandoned me without a second thought. That ends now. Margaret began making a list. The mortgage, the deeds, the insurance papers, all the documents she had meticulously stored in her safe. Every late payment Daniel had begged her to cover, every time Rebecca had complained about expenses, every quiet moment she had sacrificed for their comfort. Everything pointed to one undeniable fact. She had the legal power, and they had left her with the perfect opportunity. The next morning, she drove to the house, a short cab ride from where they had left her at the airport. Seeing it from the street, everything looked normal. Daniel's car in the driveway, Rebecca tending to Liam in the yard. They were living as if nothing had happened, as if leaving their mother stranded for hours was an insignificant inconvenience. Margaret's stomach churned with anger. She stepped out of the cab, her heels clicking against the pavement with deliberate precision, as if every step whispered a warning. She rang the doorbell. Daniel opened the door, smiling nervously. "Mom, you made it," he said, forcing cheerfulness into his voice. "We're so glad you're here." Margaret's lips curved into a polite smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, I'm here. And I've been thinking about all the sacrifices I've made for this family. About how easy it is to take someone for granted. About trust." Daniel froze. Something in her tone, calm, controlled, but with a hint of steel, made him uneasy. "I hope," she continued slowly, "that you understand just how fragile assumptions can be. About ownership, about loyalty, about what people deserve when they betray those who love them most." Rebecca peeked around the corner, sensing the tension. Liam clutched her leg. oblivious to the storm gathering in his grandmother's gaze. Margaret felt a cold thrill. The first spark of revenge had been lit, and it was burning brighter with every passing second. She turned and walked away, letting the door click softly behind her. They didn't yet realize that their abandonment had set into motion a chain of events that would completely change their lives. Margaret returned to her hotel that evening, her mind buzzing with plans. The city felt alive in a harsh, almost mocking way, like it knew what she intended but could not stop her. She pulled out her laptop and began reviewing everything: emails, bank statements, mortgage records, property deeds. Every number, every signature was a piece of a puzzle Daniel and Rebecca thought they controlled. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the rush of control she felt. She made a list. Verify ownership of the house. Confirm mortgage payments she had secretly continued covering. Consult her lawyer about the rights she still had. Prepare the perfect moment to confront them. The hotel phone rang. It was her lawyer, Mr. Hensley, a sharp man with a reputation for ruthless efficiency. "Margaret," he said, voice crisp, "I've reviewed the property documents. You're in a stronger position than you realize. Legally, the house is yours. You've been the primary owner, and the mortgage is technically under your name. They've just been enjoying it under the assumption you'd continue supporting them. That assumption can end today." Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that hides a knife behind velvet. "Good. Then let's make sure the assumption ends." She outlined her plan carefully, step by step. She would give Daniel and Rebecca time, just enough for them to realize that something was coming, but not enough to mount a defense. She would not humiliate them publicly. She preferred quiet devastation, the kind that seeped under their skin and left them powerless. That night, she barely slept. Thoughts of Liam, innocent and unaware, twisted her stomach. She didn't want to harm him, but she also refused to ignore the lesson Daniel and Rebecca had delivered by abandoning her. Every injustice she had endured had to be repaid, and the children were collateral in a game their parents had started. The following morning, Margaret visited the local bank. Under the guise of checking a few accounts and clarifying details about the mortgage, she discovered that Daniel had left some payments overdue. Not by accident. He had assumed she would cover them, as always. But Margaret was no longer the woman who allowed herself to be used. She arranged for a temporary freeze on outgoing payments, ensuring that the moment she struck, it would hit hard. She returned to the hotel, feeling the power settle like a warm weight in her chest. She wrote a short note to Daniel and Rebecca, leaving it at the house under the guise of a friendly visit. "I've been thinking about family and responsibility. Sometimes, the people we trust most disappoint us. I hope you will understand the importance of ownership, care, and gratitude." It was polite, almost gentle, but the meaning was crystal clear. By the time she returned to her hotel room, her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Mom, everything okay? You seemed distant yesterday." Margaret let the phone sit, unanswered. She allowed herself a small laugh, soft, cold, and entirely satisfying. The game had begun. Margaret slept little that night. The city was a dim bruise beyond her window. Inside, her thoughts were restless and meticulous. By dawn she had dressed in clothes that belonged to a different life, tailored, unflinching, and felt, absurdly, like a woman going to war in her Sunday best. Mr. Hensley arrived right on time, briefcase in hand, eyes like a judge's gavel. He did not smile. "We have everything in order," he said, folding a stack of papers as if he were tucking a long, patient snake into its box. "Title, mortgage history, proof of payments you made, their arrears. There's a clause, Margaret. If payments aren't brought current after demand, you may call the loan. That's what we'll do. We'll give them 30 days. If they don't respond, we proceed." "Quietly, quietly," she repeated, tasting the word. It sounded like silk wrapped around a blade. She wanted humiliation for them. Yes, but not spectacle. Humiliation, she believed, had a particular cruelty when delivered in the language they understood best, the slow, administrative hand of law and finance. They drove to the neighborhood together. The street was waking into its suburban hum. Sprinklers hissed, a newspaper thudded on a driveway, a jogger panted by with earbuds. Daniel's truck sat where she had seen it. Lawn chairs were stacked on the patio. The house looked the same as always, too well ordered, as if no one there had just abandoned another human being in an airport terminal. The deceit of normalcy made her stomach turn. Mr. Hensley walked up the path with the same calm he used for closing deals and breaking wills. He knocked once, very deliberately, and waited. Daniel opened the door, robe thrown over pajamas, hair sticking up wild like someone who had been wrenched awake. Rebecca hovered in the kitchen doorway with smear of jam on her wrist and Liam's toy car clutched in one hand. Their smiles were brittle. "Margaret," Daniel said, surprised, then cautious. "Everything okay? You look rested." "Daniel," Mr. Hensley said, voice low and precise, "we need to speak." Margaret stepped forward. She did not shout. She did not weep. She unfolded one of the envelopes with the neat efficiency of someone presenting evidence. Photocopies of bank statements, highlighted lines, dates circled in a steady hand. Her handwriting, Margaret thought, looked like the face of a woman who had prepared a will and a war plan in the same breath. "We're here to serve notice," Hensley explained. "Your mortgage is held in Mrs. Margaret Cole's name, your mother. There are arrears totaling 3 months' payments, and we have formal demand. If they're not remedied within 30 days, we will call the loan and take steps to protect the collateral." Rebecca's face went pale and then hot with a sudden, fragile anger. "You can't be serious," she hissed. "You know this house is our home. We've been here. You've been living here with the understanding that Mrs. Cole would continue support," Margaret said, voice even, the words dropping like coins on a counter. "That arrangement was always conditional. I made sacrifices for you. I paid when bills were due because I chose to. That choice is mine to continue, or not." Daniel bristled. "You're threatening to take our home? After everything we've been through? After what we've sacrificed?" "You left your mother at an airport," Margaret said. The sentence was small, but the room contracted around it. Liam, who had been playing with a wooden train in the corner, looked up. The children's faces always landed her hardest. Their confusion was a blade. "You abandoned me when I needed you. You used my bank card while you left me stranded. I will no longer be the invisible creditor of your comfort." Neighbors appeared in the periphery, curious, lawnmower-eyed. Margaret could feel their gazes like faint coal. She did not want an audience. Mr. Hensley raised his hand. "This is standard legal procedure. Mrs. Cole has the right to enforce the terms of the loan. We will provide documentation and a timeline. There is still time to resolve this without court." Daniel pushed past them and slammed the door. The sound echoed. For a breath, silence. Then Rebecca's whisper, glassy with fury, "You can't do this. You wouldn't dare." Margaret did not answer. She felt, perversely, like she had finally reclaimed a current of her own life. The polite envelope in her hand had the force of an iceberg beneath a serene sea. That afternoon she spoke with the bank again with terrible calm. She signed letters that shifted the balance of paper and power. She authorized the sending of a formal demand. No threats, only the precise, implacable language of finance. Overdue, default, remedy within 30 days, right to call the loan. She arranged for copies to be delivered to their attorney, to the county clerk, to Daniel's place of work. Each stamp a tiny drumbeat. Word spread, as it does in neighborhoods where everyone knows one another's dog's name. Daniel's phone lit with calls from relatives. Rebecca's sister texted in frantic shorthand. They made plans. They whispered about money and lawyers and what embarrassing truths might come to light. People who once nodded at Margaret's wave now stared at her as if she had stepped off a different planet. That evening, Daniel parked in the driveway at dusk and stomped up to the front door as if he would find a fault in the world and crush it with his fist. He banged on the frame, then pounded with the heel of his hand. The door did not open. A printed notice fluttered on the mat, edges ruffled by the wind. Formal demand for remedy, payments due. He ripped it up and threw the pieces into the front yard like confetti. Rebecca watched from the kitchen window, face pinched, eyes wet. The family could crumble with a theatrical rage or scramble for civilized solutions. Whatever they chose, the rules had changed. That night, as Margaret sat in her hotel room, she felt the peculiar taste of power. It was not revenge in the cartoonish sense. No champagne corks popped on the back lawn, no cruel public spectacle. It was a quiet, terrible justice. She had set in motion a legal mechanism that would force her children to account for what they had done. They would have to look at the ledger, at the dates and numbers that would not forgive them. And yet, beneath the satisfaction was a softer eddy. Worry for Liam, and for what indignity the children might choose next. She had not wanted to destroy them. She had wanted to be seen. If the storm she summoned broke their lives, that would be a cost. But she had been left at an airport terminal with a single bar of signal and a stranger's kindness. The ledger had to balance. She fell asleep to the low hum of the city, the faint sound of a neighbor's television through the thin hotel walls, thinking of how small a sound the front door had been when it closed behind her the day they left, and how loud the consequences would be when the legal drumbeat began to roll. The next morning, Margaret woke before the city had fully roused itself. A thin winter light spilled across the hotel room, illuminating the neat stack of legal documents she had prepared the night before. She sipped her coffee slowly, letting the bitterness sharpen her resolve. Today would be the first full day her children realized that leaving her stranded was not an inconsequential act. They had awakened a force they had underestimated. Back at their home, Daniel and Rebecca were already in crisis mode. Daniel paced the kitchen, muttering under his breath, the shredded notice from last night still clutched in his hand. Rebecca hovered over him, her voice sharp, cracking with anxiety. "We can't let Mom do this. We can't lose the house. We have to call a lawyer. Yesterday." Daniel shook his head, pacing like a cornered animal. "I told you she's serious, Rebecca. Look at the documents. She's meticulous. She didn't just snap. This is planned. She knows exactly what she's doing. Then we fix it," Rebecca said, slamming a hand on the counter. "We pay the arrears. We beg. We anything. She's our mother." Her voice wavered with desperation, but Margaret had never asked to be defined by their neediness. She had been a mother once, yes, but she had also been a person who had lived decades without being discarded at a rest stop. That humiliation would not go unanswered. Margaret had thought carefully about the timing of her actions. She had flown in from Phoenix, leaving her small, quiet apartment behind, a suitcase of authority and long-held patience tucked under her arm. Each flight segment, each ride through the streets of this city, had been a march toward accountability. Now, she felt the first tremors of impact radiate back toward her children. Their panic, their scrambling, was a testament to the power of measured, deliberate justice. By late morning, the first emails began arriving. Daniel's lawyer had called Mr. Hensley, trying to negotiate, trying to push for leniency. Margaret listened from her hotel room, every word a sweet, sharp chord in her chest. They were offering to pay partial arrears, suggesting a payment plan, hinting that they would attempt to convince her to rescind her demand. She let the calls go to voicemail. There would be no negotiations today, not yet. They needed to feel the weight of their recklessness. Meanwhile, Rebecca sent frantic text messages, each more pleading than the last. "Mom, please, let's talk. Don't do this. We need you." Margaret read them slowly, savoring the careful detachment she had cultivated. She didn't type back. Words, she had realized, were never enough for people who had abandoned you in an airport with no plan and no apology. The language of finance and law was a vocabulary they could not ignore. Margaret spent the afternoon reviewing every detail of her financial documents. She ensured that every payment she had made in good faith was recorded, every date, every bank transaction meticulously logged. There would be no room for argument, no loopholes for Daniel and Rebecca to exploit. Her satisfaction was quiet, the kind that comes not from cruelty but from clarity and preparedness. By evening, a faint tension crept into the neighborhood. A couple of curious neighbors had seen the flurry of legal correspondence slipping under doors. Whispers spread. "Did you hear Mrs. Cole's children are in trouble? Something about the mortgage." Margaret imagined their startled faces, the subtle shift in perception. Her children had once flaunted a comfortable, unaccountable life in this street, believing that a mother's love and money were inexhaustible. That illusion was crumbling. That night, Margaret allowed herself a rare smile. She poured another cup of coffee, staring out at the city lights. The storm had begun, and though she was careful, she felt the surge of power, a woman abandoned, now unshakable, executing justice with precision. They had underestimated her. They had misjudged what it meant to discard someone who had spent a lifetime mastering patience, foresight, and restraint. And somewhere deep in her heart, she knew. By the time the 30 days had passed, they would understand that abandoning their mother had consequences far beyond embarrassment. They would learn that life, meticulous and unyielding, does not forgive carelessness when it comes to those who once held everything for you. By the next morning, the full weight of Margaret's actions had hit Daniel and Rebecca like a hammer. Sleep had eluded them, replaced by frantic calls, whispered arguments, and the gnawing dread that their mother, whom they had so casually abandoned on that highway, was now orchestrating a slow, methodical siege on their lives. Daniel slammed his laptop shut, pushing back from the kitchen table where countless unpaid bills and bank statements were scattered. "Rebecca, she's serious. Look at this," he said, pointing at an email from Margaret's lawyer. The subject line alone made his stomach twist. Notice of intent to reclaim property and demand immediate compliance. Rebecca grabbed the printout with trembling hands. Her voice cracked. This can't be real. Mom wouldn't do this. She's our mother." Daniel's jaw tightened. "We left her on the highway, Rebecca. We abandoned her. Do you think we get to dictate what she does now?" Rebecca sank into the chair, burying her face in her hands. She had always believed that family meant immunity, that a mother's love could cover every mistake, every failure. Now, staring at the hard evidence of Margaret's meticulous preparation, that illusion had shattered. Meanwhile, in her hotel room downtown, Margaret moved with calm precision. Every call, every email, every legal document was logged, saved, and cataloged. She wasn't angry in the way they might have imagined. She was methodical, strategic, and unflinching. Her abandonment on that desolate stretch of highway had been a turning point, not a breakdown. It had awakened something she had long subdued, the quiet, unyielding power of someone who has spent decades planning for emergencies, who knows how to act when others act recklessly. Margaret poured herself another cup of coffee and reviewed the timeline once more. She had flown in 3 days ago, arriving in a city still waking from winter chill. The airport ride had been tense, a mixture of anticipation and focus. She had felt the adrenaline of stepping back into the lives of the people who had betrayed her, but her movements had been careful, deliberate. Every action counted. Every misstep was eliminated. By late morning, Daniel and Rebecca were scrambling desperately. Daniel was pacing the hallway, phone pressed to his ear as he called every lawyer he could think of. "No, no, no. We need an injunction. Yes, but we don't have time for months of court." His words were a frantic blur, and he could feel the first pangs of true fear gnawing at him. Rebecca, meanwhile, was trying to appeal to emotion. She sent Margaret a flurry of texts, each more pleading than the last. "Please, Mom, don't do this. We'll fix it. We'll pay. We can talk. Just don't hurt us like this." Margaret read them carefully, smiling faintly. They were desperate, but desperation did not erase the years of abandonment, the humiliation, the lack of care. Words alone were insufficient. By afternoon, the first neighbors noticed unusual activity. Lawyers in and out, courier deliveries, legal notices slid under doors. Whispers began to spread in the quiet suburb. "Something is happening at the Cole house. I think Mrs. Cole is taking action." The air was thick with speculation and unease, and Margaret relished the subtle ripple her presence had caused. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the buildings, Margaret sat by her hotel window, watching the city lights flicker on. She felt a rare thrill, not from malice, but from justice unfolding exactly as she had calculated. Her children had believed she was helpless, vulnerable, an elderly woman stranded on a highway. Now they were learning, painfully, that she was neither. And deep in her chest, Margaret knew this was just the beginning. In the coming days, she would tighten her control, applying pressure in ways they could neither ignore nor evade. Every action would be deliberate, every response measured. This was no longer about money, nor even about the house. It was about accountability, and teaching them the cost of betrayal in a language they could not misinterpret. For the first time since that cruel winter morning, Margaret felt fully alive. The storm she had been preparing for months was finally here, and she was ready to see it through to the last, satisfying detail. The following morning, Daniel awoke to a sense of dread that clung to him like a heavy fog. He stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, only to find Rebecca already on the phone, her voice trembling as she barked instructions to yet another lawyer. "They filed the notice," she said, her words barely audible over the line. "Margaret's lawyer, they're moving fast. We can't stop them." Daniel sank into a chair, his hands gripping the edges so tightly that his knuckles whitened. "Stop them? Rebecca, we left her on a highway, remember? We're not just dealing with a threat anymore. We're dealing with a hurricane that we caused. By mid-morning, the first wave hit. Margaret's legal team submitted documents to the county recorder's office, asserting her ownership of the Cole family home. Every paper was meticulously prepared. Deeds, notarizations, proof of the mortgage originally taken out in her name, and evidence that the so-called transfer to Daniel and Rebecca had never been legally completed. The court system, recognizing the thoroughness of the filings, accepted the documents immediately. Daniel and Rebecca stared at the stack of papers with horror. Their legal counsel tried to explain, fumbling through legal jargon, but the essence was clear. The house, everything they had thought they owned, was no longer theirs to command. The realization hit like a cold, sharp wind. We can fight this, right? Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking. Mom, she wouldn't actually. Daniel interrupted, his voice tight with fear and anger. She would. And she did. She's not asking. She's taking. And we have no choice but to respond. Meanwhile, Margaret remained composed in her hotel room downtown. She had anticipated their panic, expected their frantic attempts at negotiation, and prepared for every excuse they might offer. She poured herself a glass of iced tea, leaning back in her chair as she imagined Daniel and Rebecca pacing the living room of the now locked-down house, trying desperately to find a loophole. Later that afternoon, Margaret's courier delivered the first notice directly to the Cole residence. A formal letter stating that effective immediately, she had reclaimed full ownership of the property and any attempts to occupy it without her consent would constitute trespassing. The envelope, stamped and signed, sat on the entryway table like a harbinger of doom. Daniel tore it open, his hands shaking as he read. This can't be happening. Mom can't do this. Rebecca's knees buckled as she slumped onto the couch, staring at the floor. She's really doing it. After everything, after the highway, she's doing it. Across town, Margaret smiled faintly. It was not a cruel smile. It was the quiet satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly. Every call they made to lawyers, every frantic text and pleading email confirmed what she already knew. The house, and their sense of security, was in her hands. By evening, the tension had escalated. Neighbors whispered behind drawn curtains as movers began a discreet operation, changing locks, securing windows, and cataloging contents for eventual relocation if necessary. The Cole children, oblivious to the full legal machinations of their grandparents' war, were sent to their friends' homes for the day, leaving Daniel and Rebecca to face the consequences alone. That night, Daniel sat on the front steps, phone in hand, scrolling through messages from Margaret's lawyer detailing next steps. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of anger, fear, and disbelief. Rebecca joined him silently, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, both of them realizing the horrifying truth. Their mother, the woman they had so cruelly abandoned, had not only survived but had risen far above them, wielding power they never imagined she could reclaim. And in that moment, Daniel and Rebecca understood the lesson Margaret intended. Betrayal carries a price, and the reckoning had only just begun. The next morning, the tension in the Cole household was unbearable. Daniel paced the living room like a caged animal, muttering fragments of threats and excuses under his breath. Rebecca sat on the edge of the couch, staring blankly at the floor, her phone clutched in her hands as if it were a lifeline. Maybe we can convince her, Daniel said finally, his voice tight. Maybe if we... No, Daniel. Rebecca cut him off, her voice sharp for the first time in days. We can't. Mom isn't looking for negotiation. She's taking what's hers, and she's making sure we feel every bit of it. Meanwhile, Margaret was far away, in a small, sunlit office she had rented for the week. Every detail of the operation was accounted for. Legal filings, notices to the county, updated locks, and even a private investigator she had hired to monitor Daniel and Rebecca's movements. She sipped her tea calmly, the chaos of the Cole household playing out exactly as she had predicted. Her phone buzzed with an incoming message, a picture from the PI showing Daniel frantically rifling through drawers, papers flying, his face pale and panicked. She smiled faintly, savoring the moment. It was not joy derived from cruelty, but from the quiet justice of seeing them confronted by the consequences of their own actions. By noon, The first confrontation took place. Margaret herself appeared at the house, driving a modest sedan, sunglasses hiding the sharp intensity in her eyes. She stepped onto the porch, her posture calm but commanding, and rang the bell. Daniel answered, flustered, his hair mussed, eyes darting nervously. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Margaret's voice was steady, almost serene. "Daniel, Rebecca, I'm here to oversee the transition. Everything that is mine will be secured, and I expect full cooperation." Rebecca stepped forward, pleading, "Margaret, please can we talk about this? Can't we figure something out?" Margaret shook her head. "No, there is nothing to figure out. You abandoned me on a highway 3 days ago. You made a choice. I am simply acting on the consequences of yours." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "You can't do this. This is our home. Your home." Margaret's voice rose slightly, cold and controlled. "Your parents left their mark on this world. They left me the deed. And your decision to abandon me doesn't change ownership. You made the choice to treat me as disposable. Now you will understand what it feels like to have no control over something you thought you owned." The door behind them swung open, and movers began entering, cataloging items, changing locks, and securing the property. Daniel and Rebecca tried to argue, but each attempt was met with calm, unyielding precision. Margaret had anticipated every tactic, every emotional manipulation, every feeble excuse. As the afternoon wore on, the reality set in for the Cole children. They returned home to find their parents frantic, the locks changed, and Margaret overseeing every detail. The children, innocent yet perceptive, sensed the tension and fear in their parents, realizing for the first time the weight of the actions that had left their grandmother stranded on a highway. Margaret watched quietly, letting the scene unfold. She did not yell or berate. She did not gloat. The lesson was unfolding on its own. Betrayal carries consequences. She had wielded the law and her resolve with precision, and the reckoning was complete. That evening, as she drove back to her temporary office, Margaret allowed herself a small smile. The house was hers, secured not just legally but symbolically. Daniel and Rebecca had been forced to confront the full scope of their cruelty, and Margaret had reclaimed control, not just of property, but of her dignity. In her heart, she knew this was only the beginning. There were further steps to ensure the Cole family would never underestimate her again. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice, she realized, could be delivered without a single raised hand. Just meticulous planning, resolve, and the unwavering courage to act when wronged. The morning sunlight spilled through the blinds of Margaret's temporary office, but inside, the air was thick with purpose. Margaret had spent the night reviewing every legal document, every contingency, every potential loophole. Today, she would ensure that the Cole family could no longer manipulate or intimidate her. She would consolidate her control, legally and psychologically. Her first call was to the mortgage company. Calmly, firmly, she informed them of the ownership transfer and presented the new payment arrangements. The clerk on the other end of the line hesitated, unsure of the situation, until Margaret's quiet authority made it clear she was not asking, she was asserting. Next, she contacted the utilities. No surprises, no arguments. Everything now ran under her name. Every account, every bill, every detail accounted for. Margaret's meticulous nature had transformed what could have been a chaotic takeover into a smooth, unassailable consolidation of power. Meanwhile, the Cole household was descending into chaos. Daniel's face was pale, his hands trembling as he realized that every attempt to regain control had failed. Rebecca, once defiant, now sat in a corner, staring blankly at the floor. They both understood, finally, that Margaret's reach extended beyond mere ownership. She had positioned herself in every aspect of their lives that they had assumed were secure. Margaret decided it was time to visit the house in person. Driving back from her office, she felt a mixture of anticipation and calm determination. She parked a block away and walked the short distance, her shoes crunching on the gravel, sunglasses shielding the satisfaction flickering in her eyes. Daniel answered the door again, voice tight, a forced politeness that barely concealed his fear. "Margaret, what do you want now?" Margaret's smile was slow, deliberate. "I want to make one thing perfectly clear. This house, this property, and the well-being of every person under its roof are now under my protection. You do not get to manipulate, intimidate, or control me or anyone else ever again." Rebecca attempted to interject, her voice shaking. "But the kids," Margaret turned, her tone firm, cutting through the panic. "The kids are safe, Rebecca. They will never have to endure the chaos and abandonment you subjected me to. That is non-negotiable. Everything else is merely the consequences of your actions." The movers had returned, cataloging a few remaining items, changing final locks, and reorganizing spaces. Margaret walked through the house, noting each detail. Every room was now under her authority, every corner a statement of regained control. She paused in the living room, looking at the sunlight streaming through the windows, and imagined her grandchildren living, laughing, and thriving in the home that had been a symbol of fear and neglect. Later that evening, she returned to her office, reviewing notes and documents, making strategic plans. Margaret knew Daniel and Rebecca would not take this lightly. They would test boundaries, attempt subtle manipulations, and try to regain lost power. But she was ready. Every legal safeguard, every financial and administrative control, every contingency plan had been put in place. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat at her desk, the faint clink of the glass sounding like a small victory. For the first time in decades, Margaret felt completely in control of her life, her property, and her dignity. Her heart was calm, but her mind raced with possibilities. This was only the beginning. Margaret smiled faintly to herself. "They left me on the highway," she whispered. "But now, they will never leave me powerless again." Margaret woke that morning with a sense of calm clarity. The air in her temporary Denver apartment felt different, charged, almost electric. Today was the day she would finalize her victory, not just legally, but emotionally. She was no longer a victim. She was the orchestrator, the one holding all the cards. Her grandchildren, Lily and Noah, were at school, unaware of the storm that had quietly settled over their parents. Margaret sipped her coffee, reviewing every detail of the final action she had planned. The house had been fully transferred into her name, all accounts and utilities under her control. She had consulted with attorneys, accountants, and even a private investigator to ensure there would be no surprises. By mid-morning, she arrived at the Cole residence. Daniel opened the door, his expression tight, eyes darting nervously. Rebecca hovered behind him, attempting to maintain a posture of defiance, but failing miserably. Margaret could almost feel the tension emanating from them, the panic that comes when people realize they've lost control entirely. "I've come for one last meeting," Margaret said, her voice smooth, almost serene, but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Let's settle all remaining matters today." Daniel swallowed, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. We can talk, Margaret." Margaret entered, her presence filling the house with authority. "This is not a negotiation. It's a statement. Everything you ever assumed was untouchable has now been addressed. The house, the finances, the security of your children, they are no longer under your manipulation. You will comply, or there will be consequences." Rebecca tried to interject, her voice trembling. "Margaret, please." "No," Margaret said, firm. "No more manipulation, no more excuses. You abandoned me on that highway, left me helpless and alone. Do you understand what that did to me? Not just the humiliation, but the anger, the betrayal? You assumed I was powerless. You assumed I would come crawling back." She paused, letting the words settle in the tense room. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Rebecca's lips quivered. Margaret continued, her tone icy but controlled. "I am not powerless. I am not helpless. And you will never have that control over me again. Your time of taking advantage is over." Over the next hour, she methodically went through every detail: the mortgage, the utilities, the final legal documents. Daniel and Rebecca could only listen, powerless to challenge her authority. Margaret's calm, meticulous, and unrelenting approach left no room for argument. Finally, she turned to leave. "Remember this feeling," she said softly, almost as if it were a gift. "The fear, the helplessness you tried to impose on me, it is now mine to control. The house, the children's safety, and the respect you owe me are non-negotiable. Learn from this. Perhaps one day, you'll understand the gravity of what abandoning someone truly means." Walking out to her car, Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in decades, she experienced pure triumph, not from vengeance alone, but but from justice, clarity, and reclaimed dignity. She had taken what was hers, protected her family, and ensured the past could not be repeated. That evening, Margaret sat with Lily and Noah in the newly secured home, reading stories, sharing laughter, and savoring the safety and warmth that she had fought to guarantee. They had no idea of the tense confrontations, the legal maneuverings, or the emotional battles she had won that day. All they knew was that their grandmother was unstoppable, loving, and unwavering. Margaret glanced out the window at the Denver skyline. The city lights twinkled like stars, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel a sense of real peace. She had been left on a highway, abandoned and forgotten. But she had transformed that pain into power, turning betrayal into triumph. In the quiet of the night, she whispered to herself, "I am free, I am strong, and nothing will ever take that from me again." The storm had passed. The house was hers. Her grandchildren were safe. And Margaret finally understood the true meaning of victory. Not revenge alone, but survival, empowerment, and the courage to reclaim her life on her own terms.